Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, the land we now call the United States was home to thriving civilizations. One of the most remarkable was Cahokia, a sprawling city that stood near what is today St. Louis, Missouri. At its peak around 1050 to 1200 AD, Cahokia was larger than London at the time, with an estimated population of 10 to 20,000 people. The city was built around enormous earthen mounds, the largest of which, Monk's Mound, still stands today. Rising nearly 100 feet high and covering 14 acres at its base, this massive structure required millions of baskets of earth, carried by hand over many generations. These mounds served as platforms for temples, homes for leaders, and centers of ceremony. Walking through Cahokia in its prime, you would have seen a bustling metropolis with wooden palisades, a grand plaza, and thousands of homes arranged in careful neighborhoods. The people who built this city understood astronomy, engineering, and urban planning in ways that continue to impress archaeologists today. They tracked the seasons with wooden posts arranged in circles, similar to Stonehenge, allowing them to mark solstices and equinoxes with precision. The city sat at the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers, making it a natural hub for trade. Goods from across the continent flowed through Cahokia, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf Coast, mica from the Appalachians. The residents played a game similar to lacrosse in the Great Plaza, held elaborate feasts, and created intricate artwork. When the city was eventually abandoned around 1350, possibly due to environmental changes, resource depletion, or social upheaval, it left behind a legacy that challenges our assumptions about pre-Columbian North America. When European explorers finally did arrive, they established settlements along the coasts and rivers of this vast continent. The oldest continuously inhabited city, founded by Europeans in what is now the United States, is St. Augustine, Florida. Founded by Spanish Admiral Pedro Menéndez de Avilés in 1565, St. Augustine predates Jamestown by more than 40 years. The Spanish built a fortress there called the Castillo de San Marcos, constructed from coquina, a unique stone made from compressed seashells that could actually absorb cannonballs rather than shatter under their impact. This remarkable fortress has never been taken by force, withstanding sieges by the British and pirates over centuries. Walking the narrow streets of St. Augustine today, you can still feel the presence of those early Spanish settlers, with buildings that have stood for centuries and stories that stretch back nearly 500 years. The city has flown 5 different flags over its long history, belonging at various times to Spain, Britain, a brief period of patriots during Revolution, the Confederacy, and finally the United States. The Spanish brought with them their language, their Catholic faith, and their architectural style, with homes built around courtyards and streets designed to catch the ocean breeze. They also brought horses, cattle, and pigs to North America, animals that would transform the landscape and the lives of native peoples across the continent. St. Augustine served as a military outpost, protecting Spanish shipping lanes and claiming territory for the Spanish crown, a foothold in the New World that would influence the development of Florida for generations. Not every early settlement survived, however. One of the most haunting mysteries in American history is the lost colony of Roanoke. In the 1580s, English settlers established a colony on Roanoke Island off the coast of what is now North Carolina. The venture was led by Sir Walter Raleigh, though he himself never visited the colony. In 1587, about 115 colonists, including women and children, arrived on the island under the leadership of John White. White's daughter Eleanor gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. Shortly after, John White returned to England to gather more supplies, but his return was delayed by the Anglo-Spanish War and England's conflict with the Spanish Armada. When supply ships finally returned to the colony in 1590, 3 years later than planned, they found the settlement completely abandoned. Houses stood empty, belongings were scattered, and the only clue was the word Croatoan carved into a wooden post and CRO carved into a nearby tree. Croatoan was the name of both a nearby island and a friendly native tribe. To this day, historians debate what happened to those colonists. Did they join with the Croatoan people or other local native communities? Were they lost to disease, starvation, or conflict with hostile tribes? Did they attempt to sail home and perish at sea? Some theories suggest they moved inland and gradually integrated with native populations. Archaeological digs continue to search for evidence, and genetic studies of descendants of certain native communities have yielded intriguing but inconclusive results. The mystery endures, a reminder of how precarious these early settlements were, perched at the edge of a vast and unfamiliar land, dependent on supply lines that stretched across thousands of miles of treacherous ocean. The first permanent English settlement that did survive was Jamestown, Virginia, founded in 1607 along the James River. But survival came at an enormous cost. The colonists arrived during a severe drought, and they had chosen a swampy location where the water was brackish and disease-carrying mosquitoes thrived. The site had one military advantage. It was easily defensible against Spanish ships that might sail up the river. But for daily living, it was nearly disastrous. Many of the early settlers were gentlemen unaccustomed to hard labor, younger sons of aristocratic families seeking fortune in the New World. They expected to find gold or a passage to the Pacific Ocean, not the back-breaking work of building shelters, planting crops, and forging relationships with the native peoples who controlled the land around them. They arrived too late in the season to plant adequate crops, and their provisions quickly ran low. During the winter of 1609 to 1610, known as the Starving Time, the colony's population dropped from around 500 to just 60 survivors. People ate horses, dogs, rats, mice, snakes, and even shoe leather in their desperation. Archaeological evidence suggests some resorted to cannibalism, with butcher marks found on human bones in the trash heaps of the fort. One account describes a man who killed and ate his pregnant wife. When relief ships finally arrived in the spring, the survivors were literally preparing to abandon the settlement and return to England. Only the timely arrival of a new governor with supplies convinced them to stay. Jamestown's survival required extraordinary determination, luck, and eventually the cultivation of tobacco, which would become the colony's economic salvation and curse, creating wealth while establishing a plantation economy that would demand ever more land and labor. Central to Jamestown's early story was Pocahontas, whose real name was Amonute, and who also went by Matuaka. The name Pocahontas was actually a nickname meaning something like playful one or ill-behaved child. She was the daughter of Powhatan, whose given name was Wahunsenakau, the paramount chief of a powerful confederacy of Algonquian-speaking peoples that dominated the region around Jamestown. The Powhatan Confederacy included about 30 different tribes and controlled much of the Tidewater region of Virginia, an area encompassing approximately 8,000 square miles. Powhatan had inherited control of 6 tribes and expanded his confederacy through conquest and diplomacy to include many more. Pocahontas became famous for her association with the English, particularly the story, likely embellished or invented, of saving Captain John Smith's life by placing her head over his as her father was about to execute him. What is certain is that she served as something of a cultural ambassador, sometimes bringing messages between her father and the English, and on at least one occasion, warning the colonists of an impending attack. In 1613, during a period of hostility between the English and Powhatan, she was lured onto an English ship and taken hostage. During her captivity, she was treated relatively well, taught English and Christianity, and eventually converted, taking the name Rebecca. She married colonist John Rolfe in 1614, a union that brought about a period of peace between the English and Powhatan's people. She bore a son, Thomas, and in 1616 traveled to England with Rolfe, where she was presented at court as an example of the civilized savage, proof that native peoples could be converted and assimilated. She became a celebrity in London society. Tragically, as she was preparing to return to Virginia in 1617, she fell ill, possibly with pneumonia or tuberculosis, and died at only about 21 years old. She was buried in Gravesend, England. Her story reflects the complex, often tragic interactions between native peoples and European settlers, and the enormous cultural collisions that shaped the early colonial period. That same year Pocahontas died, something else arrived in Virginia that would forever change the trajectory of American history. In 1619, an English privateer ship called the White Lion arrived at Point Comfort, near Jamestown, carrying about 20 enslaved Africans who had been captured from a Portuguese slave ship called the San Juan Bautista. These individuals, whose names are mostly lost to history, were from the kingdom of Ndongo in what is now Angola. They became the first documented enslaved Africans in English North America. Initially, the status of Africans in Virginia was ambiguous and complex. Some were treated as indentured servants rather than slaves, working for a set period before gaining their freedom. A few even gained their freedom, acquired land and owned property, and some themselves became slaveholders. One man, Anthony Johnson, arrived as an indentured servant, gained his freedom, acquired substantial land holdings, and even went to court to assert his ownership of a man he claimed as his slave. But over the following decades, colonial laws increasingly codified racial slavery, creating a hereditary system based on race that would enslave millions and shape American society for centuries. Laws were passed stating that children inherited the status of their mother, ensuring that slavery would pass down through generations. Other laws prohibited interracial marriage, prevented enslaved people from owning property or testifying in court, and gradually stripped away any possibility of freedom or legal rights. That moment in 1619 marked the beginning of a brutal institution that would not end until the Civil War, more than 240 years later, and whose legacy continues to shape American society to this day. Also in that same remarkable year of 1619, something else significant happened at Jamestown. The Virginia Company established the House of Burgesses, the first representative legislative assembly in the Americas, allowing colonies to have a voice in their own governance. The following year, in 1620, another group of English settlers, the Pilgrims, sailed on the Mayflower and landed at Plymouth, in what is now Massachusetts. These were religious separatists who had first fled to the Netherlands to escape persecution before deciding to establish a new community in the New World. Before even setting foot on land, 41 of the male passengers signed an agreement known as the Mayflower Compact. This compact established a form of self-government, with signers agreeing to create laws for the good of the colony and promising to abide by those laws. The document was written because the Pilgrims had landed outside the territory of their original charter, in an area where they had no legal authority. They needed to create order and prevent dissension in the group. While it wasn't a constitution or a declaration of independence, the Mayflower Compact represented an important early example of people creating their own political authority through a written agreement, a social contract among equals. It planted seeds of self-governance that would grow over the following centuries, eventually blossoming into revolutionary ideas about democracy, representation, and the consent of the governed. The idea that authority derives from the agreement of the people rather than from divine right or aristocratic privilege would echo through American history. As the colonies grew and settled into life in the New World, tensions sometimes erupted in unexpected ways. One of the darkest chapters came in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, when a wave of accusations of witchcraft swept through the community. What began with a few young girls having fits and claiming to be tormented by witches spiraled into mass hysteria. The afflicted girls, including 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, began having seizures, throwing objects, screaming, and contorting their bodies in strange ways. When questioned, they accused several women of bewitching them. In the Puritan worldview, the devil was very real, and witches were his servants, capable of inflicting harm through supernatural means. Over the course of several months, more than 200 people were accused and 20 were executed, most by hanging. The one man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death under heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea. 4 others died in prison awaiting trial. The accusation spread like wildfire, with neighbors turning on neighbors, old grudges being settled through witchcraft claims, and fear overtaking reason. Those accused included church members, respected citizens, and even a 4-year-old child. The trials were deeply flawed, accepting spectral evidence, testimony that the accused person's spirit had appeared to the witness in a dream or vision, as valid proof of witchcraft. Eventually, the governor of Massachusetts intervened, dissolving the special court and prohibiting spectral evidence. The remaining accused were released or pardoned. Years later, some of the accusers and judges publicly apologized, admitting they had been wrong. The trials have since become a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria, false accusations, religious extremism, the failure of justice, and the deadly consequences of allowing fear to overwhelm reason and evidence. The phrase witch hunt entered our language as a metaphor for any campaign based on unfounded accusations and paranoia. Salem reminds us how quickly fear can overwhelm reason and how communities can turn against themselves when caught in the grip of collective panic, suspicion, and the need to find scapegoats for unexplained troubles. While colonies struggled with internal conflicts and survival, they were also drawn into competition over the continent's vast resources. One of the most valuable commodities in early colonial America was not gold or silver, but beaver pelts. Beaver fur was prized in Europe for making felt hats, which were fashionable among the middle and upper classes. The fur's unique properties, with tiny barbs that lock together when processed, made it ideal for creating waterproof, durable felt. The demand was so intense that beavers were hunted nearly to extinction in some regions. A single pelt could be worth a fortune, and the fur trade shaped relationships between European colonizers and native nations, creating alliances and fueling conflicts. The French, Dutch, and English all competed for control of beaver-rich territories, particularly around the Great Lakes, in the Hudson River Valley, and throughout the northern forests. Native peoples often found themselves in the middle of these imperial rivalries, with some nations forming partnerships with Europeans to gain access to metal tools, firearms, cloth, and other goods that transformed their lives. The Iroquois Confederacy, for example, became powerful middlemen in the fur trade, controlling access to hunting grounds and trade routes. Wars erupted over beaver territory, including the Beaver Wars of the mid-1600s, brutal conflicts that reshaped the political map of northeastern North America. The fur trade also transformed native societies, introducing new technologies and goods, but also new diseases, alcohol, and dependency on European trade. European demand for beaver pelts literally changed the landscape as beaver populations crashed and the wetlands and waterways they had maintained began to disappear. The humble beaver, with its valuable pelt, helped determine which empires would rise and fall in North America, which native nations would gain power or lose it, and how the continent's ecology would be forever altered. Finally, while most people know about the famous California gold rush of 1849, fewer realize that America experienced an earlier gold rush right in North Carolina. In 1799, a 12-year-old boy named Conrad Reed found a 17-pound gold nugget in a creek on his family's farm in Cabarrus County. The story goes that Conrad was fishing when he spotted something shiny in the water. He took the massive rock home, and for 3 years, the family used it as a doorstop, not realizing what it was. In 1802, Conrad's father, John Reed, took the rock to a jeweler in Fayetteville, who recognized it as gold and offered to buy it for $3.50, an enormous sum for the time, but a tiny fraction of its actual value of about $3,600. Once word spread of Reed's discovery, gold fever struck North Carolina. By the early 1800s, prospectors were panning streams and digging mines across the Carolina Piedmont. For decades before California's discovery, North Carolina was actually the nation's leading gold producer, with finds also in Georgia, Virginia, and other southern states. Small mining towns sprang up overnight, with names like Gold Hill and Goldstone. the federal government established a branch mint in Charlotte in 1837 to process the gold being discovered, turning it into coins right there in North Carolina. Miners used simple panning techniques at first, swirling sediment in shallow pans to let the heavier gold settle to the bottom, but eventually developed more sophisticated operations with hydraulic mining and stamp mills to crush ore. This early gold rush was smaller and quieter than California's, lacking the mass migration and dramatic stories of the 49ers. But it demonstrated that the American landscape held riches that would continue to draw people westward in search of fortune. It also established mining techniques and created a generation of experienced prospectors who would later head to California when gold was discovered there. The North Carolina gold rush faded as California's boom began, but it had already written its chapter in American history, a prelude to the larger rushes that would shape the settlement of the American West.